What's most troubling about this legislation is that there are extremely vague categories such as misinformation and hate speech that are very, very difficult to define in law. So this opens the door to a form of arbitrary bureaucratic power over the platforms.
What will be the impact of the European Union's sweeping new rules for big tech? Not just on Europe, but also on America.
They can also declare an emergency, and in the event of declaring an emergency, require the platforms to take special measures to counteract the emergency.
In this episode, I sit down with David Thunder, a political philosopher and research fellow at the Institute for Culture and Society at the University of Navarra. This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Jekielek. David Thunder, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Jan.
Why don't we just jump right into it? What is this Digital Services Act?
Well, the Digital Services Act is a piece of legislation that just went through the European Parliament recently, and it actually is concerned with the regulation of online platforms such as Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, TikTok, and so on. It gives the European Commission oversight over these platforms, and they can actually undertake a kind of review of the platform's policies and regulations over the previous year. And if the platform has not been in compliance with their requirements, these platforms can be fined a massive amount, billions and billions of dollars. Whenever a government wants to make the case for having more power, we should be very suspicious. And you would think, in fact, that during an emergency, you would want a more open internet and a more open flow of information so that vital information that is concealed or that is not easy to access can actually come to the fore. You would not think the opposite, that in fact shutting down information is the best thing you can do to manage an emergency. Much of the news and commentary that happens in the world gets filtered through these platforms. So even though they're private platforms, they act as public forums. And that's a very important point to make, that they do have a public function in our democracies. And so any form of oversight of these platforms by, say, the European Commission is something that I think people who care about democracy should be concerned about. And of course, nobody would object to them taking down child pornography. That's not the issue. The issue with this legislation is that there are extremely vague categories such as misinformation and hate speech that are very, very difficult to define in law, that the auditors of Twitter or other platforms, the people who are auditing them on a regular basis, have to take these categories into account and decide whether the platforms have sufficiently enforced rules against disinformation and hate speech. And if they haven't, they'll be heavily fined, and they could even be suspended from operating in the European Union eventually. But these categories are nowhere defined in law in a clear way. So this opens the door to a form of arbitrary bureaucratic power over the platforms.